Hello and welcome back to our series of lectures on the Hellenistic age. Last time we were looking at the Ptolemies and the Hellenistic dynasty that ruled Egypt for 300 years following the conquest of the Persian Empire by Alexander. At that time, Egypt had been a province of the Persian Empire, and following Alexander's death, the whole area was taken over, the whole area of Egypt was taken over by Ptolemy, who established a dynasty that ruled successfully for 300 years, its last independent ruler being Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra, mistress of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. And it was upon her death in 31 BC that Egypt finally lost its independence and became another province of the Roman Empire. We talked about the system of government in Ptolemaic Egypt last time, and we saw that the Ptolemies presented themselves as pharaohs to their Egyptian subjects, but as Greek kings to their subjects in Alexandria. And it is to Alexandria that I want to turn today, because Alexandria in antiquity, as in the early part of the 20th century, was probably the most glorious, sophisticated and cosmopolitan city of the Eastern Mediterranean. Certainly, in recent literature, it has played that same role. If one reads the poems of Constantine Cavafy, the Greek poet who was born and grew up in Alexandria, or the novels of Lawrence Durrell, one finds a city which in the early part of this century could boast of many families of different backgrounds, where people would grow up speaking 5 languages, where Jewish bankers and British naval officers and Italian merchants rub shoulders with each other in an environment of absolute tolerance, a truly glorious and cosmopolitan city, a true example of the idea of the melting pot. So it was in the Hellenistic world as well. It was the jewel of the Hellenistic world. It was not only the seat of the court of the Ptolemies, but also its library and its museum were the 2 premier cultural institutions of the Hellenistic age. And so today what I want to do is look a little bit more at Alexandria and to look at these institutions and to try to recreate in some sense what life was like in this glittering jewel in the crown of the Ptolemies. Well, located at the western end of the Nile Delta, Alexandria's very location evokes its somewhat ambiguous nature. The pharaohs, you recall, had ruled in cities like Memphis and Thebes and Luxor, where there were great temples advertising their relationship to the gods and where their dead ancestors were buried and worshipped. But the Ptolemies chose not to build along the Nile Valley, but rather to situate themselves at a remove, at a point where the Nile spews out into the Mediterranean. And this idea of being next to Egypt rather than in Egypt as such is really something that does not begin with the Ptolemies and doesn't even begin with the founding of Alexandria. There had been Greek traders living in the area on the edge of the delta going back at least to the 6th century BC at the city of Naucratis, a city where Greek traders and merchants would come from around the entire Eastern Mediterranean to do their business with the pharaohs and the king's agents. And that pattern was exactly copied once again by Ptolemy. It is also an area that was well known to the Greeks, not only by the foundation of Naucratis, but also because Homer had mentioned this area. He talks about an island called Pharos, which lies just off the coast of Egypt. And that island of Pharos, which came to be connected to the mainland, was the point at which Alexandria was physically located. And it was on that island, or the tip of that peninsula, that the great lighthouse of Alexandria was built. And in fact, that lighthouse was known to the Greeks as Pharos, taking its name from the very island. Alexander was supposed to have been responsible for the city's foundation, and we have a detailed account of the foundation myth that comes from Alexandria. The foundation story, recorded in Plutarch, gives us some idea of what the Alexandrians, and particularly the Ptolemies, wanted to project about their city's foundation. Let me read you a section of it. And as you listen to this, I think you'll find that the Alexandrians are not really interested at all in anything to do with Egypt. They are seeing their city as a kind of divine foundation of the Greeks. And so Plutarch tells us that once Alexander had come to Egypt, he then left behind him a large and populous Greek city which would bear his name. Alexandria. On the advice of his architects, he was about to measure out and enclose a certain site when during the night, as he was sleeping, he saw a remarkable vision. This is a good Greek foundation legend that a god or some divine character appears to the founder during his sleep. So he has this remarkable vision, and listen to what happens in this vision. He thought he saw a man with very white hair and a venerable appearance standing beside him and speaking these lines. Then there is an island in the stormy sea in front of Egypt. They call it Pharos. Now, this isn't a god, this isn't Asclepius, the healer god, it isn't Zeus and it isn't Apollo. It's a venerable old man. No Greek god is described in those terms. I'd strongly suggest this is Homer appearing to him. So Homer, who Alexander read every night, remember he had the Iliad under his pillow, appears to him and recites to him 2 lines from the Odyssey describing the location of Pharos. And it's there that Alexander decides to found his city. He rose at once and went to Pharos, which at that time was still an island a little above the Canobic mouth of the Nile, but which has now been joined to the mainland by a causeway. When he saw that the site was eminently suitable, it is a strip of land similar to a fairly broad isthmus running between a large lagoon and the sea, which terminates in the great harbour, he exclaimed that Homer was admirable in other respects and was also an excellent architect. And so he follows the guidance that comes in the dream of divine inspiration. He goes to Pharos, and then he has to actually lay out the external circumference of the city, which is what the founder of a city will always do. Since there was no chalk available, he used barley meal to describe a rounded area on the dark soil to whose inner arc straight line succeeded. So he's laying out the grid plan of the city. And it produced the figure of what is called in Greek a chlamys, which is to say a Macedonian military cloak, a trapezoidal shape, if you like. The king was delighted with the plan when suddenly a vast multitude of birds of every kind and size flew from the river and lagoon onto the site like clouds. Nothing was left of the barley meal as these birds came down and picked it up. And even Alexander was much troubled by the omen, but his seers advised him. This is when you need to have a seer to always give you a good interpretation. There was nothing to fear. In their view, the city he was founding would abound in resources and would sustain men from every nation. He therefore instructed his overseers to press on with the work. So the city is founded thanks to a dream. It is laid out by Alexander himself, and then there is an omen from the gods to suggest that it is going to be a prosperous city. These are the stories that the Macedonians liked to tell. Some of these elements are quite straightforward. The divine inspiration, the birds promising the future prosperity of the city. I think even the shape of the city, likened to a Macedonian war cloak, the cloak worn by a Macedonian soldier, is meant in a way to evoke this notion that the Macedonians promulgated, that their land, their empire, was spear-won territory. It was won by the might of their soldiery. So the city of Alexander was meant to be, in some respects, an evocation of this conquest by Alexander and also then by his Macedonian successors. Now, Alexander didn't live to see the foundation of the city, or to see its building, I should say, and it's entirely likely that the original city was there primarily to act as a garrison on the edge of Egypt and looking towards Cyrenaica, and also to act like Naucratis as a trade emporium to encourage trade between Egypt and the Mediterranean. But whether it was intended only for those simple purposes or whether it was designed as something more, what we know is that its location proved to give it a brilliant advantage. And the Greeks themselves understood this, and we have a short description that I want to give you from Strabo, written in the 2nd century, when he comments on the advantages of the site. The advantages of the site are many, he says, for first, the place is watched by 2 seas. You have to imagine a coastline with the Mediterranean above and then a lake to the south. So it's in a strip of land between 2 seas. In the north by the so-called Egyptian Sea, which we would call the Eastern Mediterranean, and in the south by Lake Mareotis. Many canals from the Nile fill it, so there are canals running from the Nile and through the delta down to Lake Mareotis, from above and on the sides, and through these, and this is interesting, far more goods are imported than from the sea. In other words, there's more produce coming into Alexandria from the Nile Valley than coming from outside. with the result that the harbour on the lake was much wealthier than the one on the sea. And here the exports from Alexandria are greater than the imports. So this trade emporium was brilliantly located to allow all the material coming up from southern Egypt, from Upper Egypt, to be brought towards the Mediterranean and then from there exported out. And as we know from the lecture last time, all of that trade was controlled by the Ptolemies. It was their agents that stored and traded all these goods. So its brilliant location added then to the prosperity of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was really the first Ptolemies who brought this city into existence. They ennobled the city by making it Alexander's city, and they were helped in this quest of calling the city of Alexander by the fact that the body of Alexander was there in Alexandria. How could that be? Surely Alexander would be buried either in Babylon where he died or back in Macedonia where the Macedonian kings came from. Well, the answer is that after his death, his generals spent a number of months preparing a glorious funeral cortege which would bring his body in state across Asia back to Macedon. But once it got halfway, it was hijacked by Ptolemy, brought back to Alexandria, and it was installed in the center of the city, and it became the center, like the mausoleum of Lenin in Moscow. Let me read you the description here. The so-called Seyma, or tomb, is also part of the royal palaces. This was an enclosure in which were the tombs of the kings and of Alexander. So the royal mausoleum is right in the middle of town. For Ptolemy, son of Lagus, it's Ptolemy I, got in ahead of Perdiccas and took the body from him when he was bringing it down from Babylon. He hijacked it in Syria. We've got another account that speaks of the flying column of men sent up to grab this and then to spirit it back down to Alexandria. He gave it burial in Alexandria where it now lies, though not in the same sarcophagus. The present one is made of glass, while Ptolemy placed it in one made of gold. So in Strabo's time you could actually go to Alexandria and you could see the embalmed body of Alexander inside his glass coffin. This hijacking, I think, makes Alexander the central attraction of the city, and it gives us an idea of what role Alexander played in this Hellenistic world. Alexandria is the quintessential Hellenistic creation. It carries the name of Alexander. Its foundation myth says that it was brought into being by Alexander through his inspiration and through his actual laying out of the city. And yet, in some ways, it is more truly a city of the Ptolemies who are evoking the Alexandrian connection, since it was they who developed it and made it into the Greek capital of their Hellenistic kingdom. Alexandria was different from the rest of Egypt. Here, the population was not composed of what the Greeks would call the laoi, the peasants. Rather, the population was primarily Greek and Macedonian. But there were also others who came into the city to add to its cosmopolitan flavour. There would have been, we know of, Italian merchants coming there. We know that there were Phoenician merchants from Tyre and Sidon coming there, and probably Berbers from North Africa. And one such group which came to the city, and which, like most of the other groups, eventually adopted Greek speech and wrote Greek and behaved with Greek manners, one such important group in the city was the Jewish community, which lived in the northeastern quarter of the city. And it was very important for this community of Jews living in Alexandria to maintain that the Ptolemies and the high priests in Jerusalem maintained friendly relations. This was a way of confirming their own status as a privileged community. And so we have a document going back to the 2nd century, probably fictitious, but interesting nonetheless, which purports to be a letter from King Ptolemy to Eleazar, the high priest in Jerusalem. And while while it may be fictitious, I think it does give us an idea of what the Alexandrian Jewish community wished to project of its relations with the Ptolemies. King Ptolemy to Eleazar the high priest, greetings and good health. Since it happens that many Jews have been settled in our country, some of whom were transplanted from Jerusalem by the Persians during their period of rule, and others came as captives to Egypt in our fathers' day, we have given their freedom to over 100,000 prisoners of war, paying their owners the proper value in money and putting right any harm done through the impulses of the crowd. an interesting suggestion that perhaps not everything was calm in Alexandria. And later on we do know of race riots and ethnically divided hostilities in the city. But what follows is particularly interesting. It was our intention, says Ptolemy in his letter, to perform a pious deed and to dedicate a thank offering to the greatest God. Notice how he doesn't say which God. So in deference perhaps to the monotheism of the Jews, he doesn't say who has kept our kingdom in peace and in the greatest renown throughout the whole inhabited world. We've enrolled in the army those in the prime of age and those capable of being in our service who are deserving of trust at the court, and we've appointed them to official positions. Now, in fact, we do know of Hellenized Jews serving throughout Egypt. We know of Hellenized Jews who were acting as tax farmers, as bureaucrats for the Ptolemaic civil service. We know of some of them acting as mercenaries and holding a garrison down at Elephantine, for example, and military settlers in the countryside. So there were many Hellenized Jews, Jews who had taken on Greek language and practice, living throughout the kingdom. But look at what Ptolemy asks of the high priest in Jerusalem. He says, now as we wish to show favour to them, to all the Jews in the inhabited world and to those of future generations, we've decided to have your law translated from the Hebrew language you use into Greek, so that they too may be available in our library together with the other royal books. And he actually then commissions Eleazar to appoint a series of elders who are versed both in Hebrew and in Greek to provide a translation of the Hebrew Torah, which will eventually come to us as the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. So this was a city where it seems as if many different groups lived cheek by jowl and managed to get on with each other. Many of these non-Egyptians were connected directly or indirectly to the court of the king, known as the aulos, which in some estimates physically occupied 1/4 of the entire space of the city. So we have to imagine a city where much of the city is actually built up using the great buildings of the palace, the museum, the library, the body of Alexander, and many people living around the palace earning their daily bread from working for the Ptolemaic palace. There were craftsmen in Alexandria, such as silversmiths, such as goldsmiths and jewelers, and clearly they're producing material for consumption by their Ptolemies. There are painters and there are mosaic makers responsible for the glorious decoration of the palace. And these men made the city into an artistic capital that people came from all around the Mediterranean to see. Dyers, weavers, merchants, teachers, doctors, all of these people flocked from around the Greek world to come to Alexandria. And we have poems written by Greek poets saying, for example, if you're really poor and you need some cash, go to Ptolemy, he pays the most for a good mercenary. So everyone felt that they could get a job if they went to Alexandria. Alexandria must have been very much like New York in the 20th century, and it existed not only in reality but in the minds of people in much the same way as well. At the same time, since Egypt was a massive producer of oil and grain, we've already seen that in previous lectures, Alexandria was also a mercantile capital. It was a centre through which all of Egypt's produce was filtered as it was exported out to the rest of the Mediterranean. And it's this confluence of factors of the strong central authority of the Ptolemies, their dynastic power, the phenomenal wealth of Egypt all being filtered through here, and the exclusivity of Greek culture, their desire to remain separate from the rest of Egypt. These all, I think, contribute to making Alexandria probably the most glorious, the richest, and the most creative centre of Hellenistic culture. The heart of this Hellenistic culture was the museum, named for the Muses. Museion in Greek simply means the Temple of the Muses. It was founded by Ptolemy I, who was known as Ptolemy Soter, Ptolemy the Saviour, and it was modelled on an Athenian institution of the same name. And in the museum, or the Museion, back in Athens, the library of Aristotle was housed. And so the library in Alexandria was also considered to be a part of the museum. They went hand in hand, the two institutions. Ptolemy I appointed an Athenian by the name of Demetrius of Phaleron, an Athenian philosopher, to organize a collection of texts which eventually grew to 500,000 volumes. the largest library in the ancient world. The post of librarian was not merely that of a glorified cataloguer. Rather, the librarian who was in charge of this institution and also in charge of the Museion was one of the most influential men at the court of the Ptolemies. He was really like a minister of culture, if you will, and even served as the tutor of the children of Ptolemy. So it was a very prestigious institution, and it was honoured by the official dynasty. Now, throughout most of the 19th and the 20th centuries, modern scholars have been fascinated by the library, but there are no physical remains that we have to give us an idea of its exact location or its exact layout and size. Because there was no physical evidence, people relying on literary descriptions have nearly always assumed that the whole institution of the library and the museum together represented an attempt by the Ptolemies to connect themselves with the older Athenian culture. So we have a Museion at Athens, and now we have a new one in Alexandria, and particularly to put themselves in the Aristotelian tradition. And for many people, this desire to replicate Athenian culture, older classical culture, and to make it grander in this Hellenistic setting is typical of the way that the Hellenistic Greeks were really uninterested in learning anything from their contacts with indigenous cultures. But there's a new analysis of the library that I want to share with you, because if it's correct, it may be that there is a much greater degree of fusion between the two cultures than we've previously expected. Descriptions of the library and the museum suggest that the complex may have resembled a funerary temple, the funerary temple of Ramses at Thebes. In other words, it may have been based on a ground plan copied from an Egyptian prototype. At the back of the temple of Ramses, at the Ramesseum, was a set of banquet chambers decorated with depictions of the king paying homage to Osiris. And in this area there were shelves housing scrolls which were probably sacred texts, books of the dead and so forth. Well, like the Ramesseum, the Museion, or the museum and the library in Alexandria, also had a communal dining room where the various scholars and priests at work in the museum came to eat. It too housed books, and not just any books, but sometimes sacred volumes, such as the ones that we've heard Ptolemy commissioning from the high priest in Jerusalem. Jewish sacred texts, Babylonian sacred texts would have been stored here as well. And not only that, the building of the library and the museum, the entire complex, probably abutted the Sema, the mausoleum of Alexander the Great. So that just as at the Ramesseum, one has the tomb of the pharaoh next to this complex, so too in the library museum, one has the tomb of the great and heroic Alexander. So this can't be proved conclusively, but it's really worth considering that this institution, which people regard as quintessentially Hellenistic Greek, may in fact have owed a great deal to an Egyptian prototype. I think that's a wonderful idea. There's a short description of some of the layout of the museum and the library in Strabo. He's been talking here in his description of Alexandria about the way that most of the city is occupied by the palaces. And he talks about their location close to the harbour. And he says the museum also forms part of the royal palaces. It has a covered walk, an arcade with recesses and seats, and a large house in which is the dining room of the learned members of the museum. This association of men, he says, shares common property and has a priest of the Muses who used to be appointed by the kings but is now appointed by Caesar, Strabo's writing during the Roman period. The so-called Sema is also part of the royal palaces, and he goes on to describe that. We've already looked at that description. So, a wonderful institution. It would have been a glorious place to work. I think any university professor that reads that description is green with envy, particularly because you got to do pure research and no teaching. But it may have had an Egyptian model. Inside the museum and the library, scholars and poets and scientists toiled away, producing some of the most innovative thought and the most innovative art of the Hellenistic age. For example, the three greatest poets of the Hellenistic period, and once again we have this tendency to think in terms of threes, the three periods of Greek history. Later on we're going to see the three great sculptors. For the Hellenistic age, the three great poets all end up at one time or another working at the museum. I'm not going to go into great detail about them right now because we'll have another lecture on poetry later, but briefly their names are Callimachus, Theocritus and Apollonius. And each of them represents a new direction in Hellenistic poetry. Pastoral poetry, set in an idealized countryside dealing with the lives of shepherds, is in fact a very carefully wrought and highly artificial genre of poetry. It's not cowboy poetry at all. It's actually the poetry written for a court, for an elite. So it was clearly appropriate for the Ptolemies. Poems dense with allusion to mythology are also produced at the time, and to understand these poems you really have to know Greek mythology inside out. That's clearly not written for an Egyptian audience. It's written for Greeks, and well-educated Greeks, that can share in-jokes about references to events in Greek myth. Epic poetry is still being composed as well, but the epic poetry that we find being composed in the Hellenistic period is very different from Homer's epic. It is much more an epic that is concerned with the interior life, the psychological drives of the hero, and we'll look more at that later on. But this plays a very important role in the Western European tradition of epic, because the poet most influenced by this is Virgil, who produces Rome's great epic, the Aeneid. And Aeneas, the hero of that poem, is really, though the poem is written in Latin, he's really a Hellenistic hero. His interior concerns are really those that are shown in Hellenistic poetry. The museum, of course, was also known for scientific inquiry, and one can mention here in particular one of the librarians, a man known as Eratosthenes. His nickname was Beta. Beta because, as we would say, he was jack of all trades, master of none. He was never alpha, but he was always very good as the number two man in a range of fields. He wrote histories, he wrote chronicles, he did geography, he did mathematics. It is one of his scientific experiments that in a way best sums up the spirit of science in the Hellenistic age. Eratosthenes observed that if you were at Aswan in Upper Egypt, to the south, if you were there and you held a vertical pole of a particular length at midsummer on a particular day, it cast no shadow because the sun was directly overhead. If you held a pole of exactly the same size on exactly the same day at exactly the same time in Alexandria, by measuring the length of the shadow that it cast, he was able to calculate that the distance between the two sites represented 7 1/5 degrees, or 1/50th of a circle. Since he knew the relative value of that distance, and he knew the absolute value, namely 500 miles, because the distance was measurable, he was able to calculate the circumference of the globe, which he calculated at 25,000 miles, and the diameter of the globe, which he calculated at 7,850 miles. An error, so I am told, I'm not a scientist, of only 50 miles. Now, that I always find a pretty astonishing bit of scientific reasoning, because it is essentially working out the size of this planet using 2 sticks. That, I think, is quite an accomplishment. Other scientific advancements included the work of Euclid, and of course Euclid's theorems remained the basis of Western geometry and mathematics for another 2,000 years. And lesser known, but probably just important in the long run, is the work of Hypsicles, who divided the circle into 360 degrees. So that many of the approaches to mathematics that we take for granted today really derive from research during the Hellenistic period. The library was not concerned with applied science at all. It was really speculative brilliance that was the hallmark of Greek scientific thinking, both before and during the Hellenistic period as well, as it continued to flourish under royal patronage. And a last area that we'll mention, one that many people don't pay much attention to, but it's important to historians like me. Alexandria is the first place in the West where people are engaged in the systematic study of text. It is in Alexandria that scholars take all the different versions of Homer that people are reading and they try to work out which is the proper authoritative text of Homer. So, the next time you pick up a book that has been edited, say Moby Dick or some other classic, if you can rely on that text as being an authoritative text as opposed to just some bogus knockoff copy, then you should think of one of the scientists or one of the grammarians working in the library in the museum at Alexandria, because that is the legacy of their scholarship.